I'm talking today with Micere Keels, who's the author of an insightful article in this month's EL, Building Racial Equity Through Trauma-Responsive Discipline. Dr. Keels is the director of the Trauma-Responsive Educational Practices Project at the University of Chicago. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Keels.
Thank you. Very happy to be here and happy to be able to talk with you.
Great. Can you start by telling me a little bit about what the Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project is?
Yeah, so the project actually started with interviews with principals and teachers and school counselors and social workers about 7 years ago in schools located in high crime neighborhoods in Chicago, where kids were just being exposed to a lot of chronic stress and trauma and coming to school with very dysregulated behaviors. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times those behaviors are responded to with punitive discipline, which actually exacerbates the problems. And so through initial work and interview with those schools, we just got to work more in thinking about how to translate the knowledge, the science on stress and trauma and dysregulation, as well as what we know works in counseling practices with those students for how teachers and broader school members of the school staff could implement those practices in their classrooms and throughout the school in order to make schools spaces that are more supportive of positive behavior change.
Mm-hmm. And so you do trainings with teachers and that type of thing?
Yes, through the project, we have a website that does a lot of dissemination work of what we learn from like the 15 or 20 schools that we're working with at any one point in time. So that's kind of we also want to just more broadly provide resources for educators, but in schools in Chicago and some schools in Ohio, we do direct work with administrators to build their capacity and think about policies in the schools, and then direct coaching with teachers to think about what's happening in their individual classrooms with students who are exhibiting challenges, and also kind of like school-wide broad professional development. So on a lot of levels, just really trying to build the capacity of the school staff to meet students' needs.
Yeah, that's terrific. In your EL article, you write that disciplining students in trauma-responsive ways can actually be connected to racial equity, bringing racial equity in schools. Can you say a little bit about that connection?
Yeah, so one of the things that we know is that racial and ethnic minority and lower income students are more likely to be in schools that use punitive, harsh, and formal and more police-oriented discipline practices rather than practices that focus on redirection and counseling and positive behavioral supports. And so students might be exhibiting the same challenging behaviors, but based on the school that they're in, receive very different responses. And so that's an issue of educational equity, because we know that more punitive and harsh and exclusionary discipline practices actually, in the long run, are associated with increased behavioral problems and behavioral challenges. And so what we're trying to move on with asking all schools to move towards more trauma-responsive discipline is thinking about discipline opportunities or behavioral challenges as opportunities to understand what the underlying problems are, and then respond in ways that move towards behavioral improvement rather than just punishment.
You talk in your article about the need for teachers to be more responsive to students who are traumatized and have behavior problems, responsive rather than reactive. Can you talk about what it would look like for a teacher to be reactive to a type of behavior versus being responsive?
And so we very specifically use responsive versus reactive to think about whether you are just being emotional in your reaction. So absolutely, students challenging behaviors creates emotional reactions in us as adults and as teachers. We are simply human. That is a natural aspect of being in interpersonal interactions, is to have emotional reactions. And when students challenge our authority, when students are quote unquote disobedient or obstinate, or when students are just behaving in ways that we find disrespectful, all of those things are going to create emotional reactions in us as adults. And when we are reactive, we are acting based on that emotion. So because I now feel disrespected, or I feel upset, or I will respond in a way that is then reacting to my emotion to their behavior, rather than being responsive. Responsive is saying, I feel the emotion, but I'm going to take a pause and think about what is the best response to the student that can lead to an improvement and lead to this being a learning opportunity for the student. And so when we ask educators to be responsive, we're asking them to not ignore their emotional reaction, because we're all human, but to get into the habit of pausing before responding, and then thinking about, how do I make sure that the student leaves this interaction having learned something that will improve their behavior?
So let's say maybe a student stands up and has a very disruptive outburst in class. What would a responsive, maybe first, what would a reactive look like, and what would a responsive look like?
Right.
In terms of what you'd say to the student.
Yes, a reactive response is responding to just that surface behavior of them having disrupted your classroom and feeling an immediate need to show all these students in the class that that is not accepted, it won't be tolerated. And so a reactive response attempts to kind of shut the student down immediately. And that can oftentimes be a very critical response that then is felt by the student as a kind of like a public critical response from the educator, that they then feel invalidated and the need to strike back even more. A responsive way of dealing with that is to kind of say, I hear you, this is not the moment, let me finish this, and then I will come to your desk. So it's saying, if a student stands up and does something, oftentimes something has happened, or they have felt something where they need and want your attention in some way. And so it is acknowledging that, I acknowledge that you need and want my attention. This is not the right moment or way to get that. But I'm also telling you that I will give you my attention. And I'm also going to try to teach you to wait a little bit. So I'm going to ask you to sit back down, letting you know that I will get to you. And so when you get to the student, you can then have all of your conversations and discussions about the fact that that was not the appropriate way, and that here's a different way to do it. And you've also de-escalated the situation by not reacting to it in a way that then the student feels like they have to react to your reaction. So it does kind of all of those things at the same time. And when you do that with students repeatedly, they begin to learn how to respond and how to get your attention in ways that will be productive and positive.
You also talk a lot in the article about the teacher needs to stay emotionally neutral, you know, and I love that term, and recognizing your emotions, but not letting them take over. And you mentioned how hard that is in a tough moment to be emotionally neutral. What are some strategies, or are there some ways teachers can sort of practice so that emotional neutrality almost becomes automatic.
Right now, really, mindfulness is one of the best tools for that. And mindfulness practices that focus around using your breath. So if you just Google online mindfulness videos using breath, you'll get tons of videos that come up that are 2 minutes long to 30 minutes long that are reflective practices that get you to practice how to just breathe slow and deep and calm. And by doing some of those as regular practices, you essentially just learn how to be present with your emotions and with yourself. You can then bring that into your interactions with students, and being able to know that it only takes a moment to take 3 breaths. And in taking those 3 breaths, it can change substantially from being just immediately reactive to pausing just long enough and slowing yourself down with those 3 breaths to be more responsive. So that's one of the ways that we ask teachers. And another way is asking them to reflect. So if you are reactive in a moment, it's fine. It's life. We're all human. But what we often do is then that kind of lingers with us, and we feel awful about how we responded and how something went. Is when those moments happen, when those interactions happen, take a few minutes at the end of your day, or at lunch or at another time, to kind of just reflect on what happened, so that reflection also gets you, improves your ability so that the next time it happens, you're a little less reactive because you reflected on the last time.
I noticed you mentioned in some of the training materials, teachers might even use some kind of internal calming mantra in the moment. Is that a strategy you've had teachers use, and what kind of mantra might they try?
Yes. So one of those mantras is literally repeatedly telling yourself, this is not about me. And that's really something that we try to get teachers to understand, is that when the behavior in the moment is not in line with what just happened. So all you did was ask the student to please, I'm going to need you to turn around, to stop talking with your neighbor, turn around and turn to page 28. And the student has an emotional outburst in response to that. That is not about you, and that is not about the current moment. And so it is really helpful to get into the habit of when those things happen, just saying it to yourself, like, yes, this is here with me, but this is not about me. Because it's when we take it personally that it's about me, that we then are much more reactive. But when we can say, this is not about me, something else is going on with the student, this is not about me, I need to find out what's happening, this is not about me, it helps you to be a little less emotionally reactive, and then kind of say, okay, so this is not about me, I need to ask some questions. Like, what's going on? You seem upset. Has something happened? That then will allow me to get hopefully a little bit of information and insight into why you just blew up over me asking you to turn around.
You talk about the need for a teacher to use co-regulation when a student is perhaps experiencing trauma and being very upset. What does it mean to use co-regulation? What does that look like?
Co-regulation can really only happen when you are responsive, because co-regulation is psychological concept of using your self-regulation to calm somebody else. So one way that it looks among just adults is when an emergency or a disaster or a crisis happens, and there is somebody who is becoming very emotionally upset and kind of spiraling out emotionally. Someone else who's very calm maintains their calm in their communication with that person. And so even though that person's getting really upset, they kind of say, well, here is step one that we can do, and here's the next thing that we can do. And as you really hold your calm when interaction with somebody else who is really emotionally distressed, they will begin to reflect some of your calm. So it will bring them back down just a little bit. And as you keep doing it, it just brings them down more and more. And so that's co-regulation, is when I'm regulated in a situation, I will maintain my calm and my self-regulation, and I will use that to help you calm down. Rather than telling the person, you need to calm down, that just does not work. It is saying, let me demonstrate for you, and let me interact with you in a way that's going to be much more helpful. And so that's co-regulation between a teacher and a student, is when that student is getting emotionally escalated, is that teacher maintaining their calm in that context and really using that to demonstrate to the students. So it's really slowing a lot down with the way that you're speaking, keeping your tone modulated, and keeping your voice actually a little bit low, because when your voice is a little bit low, someone has to lean in to hear you. And so by doing those things, you are slowing the other person down just a little bit. And then with students, because you're also in a developmental relationship, it's helpful to offer them some strategies. So it's helpful to kind of say, I'm going to take 2 breaths right now. Can you take those 2 breaths with me? And demonstrating and doing it with them to take those 2 deep breaths or something. And then each step along the way, as you're intentionally trying to just de-escalate and slow them down, the big piece of co-regulation is that you have to stay regulated in order to then use it to help the students get regulated.
And I'm thinking that if others in the class were witnessing that, they'd be sort of calming down and, would keep the whole thing from spiraling into the rest of the class, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the big things that sometimes we can forget as educators is that if we are having an escalated interaction with a particular student, it means that the other students in the classroom are also probably feeling unsafe and unsure and becoming a little bit distressed themselves, versus if they can see us having a co-regulated interaction where we are actively calming the student down, they're going to take those deep breaths with us as you're working with that particular student. So you work with that particular student, that it also benefits the other students in the classroom that can see it and hear it.
I'm going to kind of switch gears to a question about school resource officers. You note in your article that having, police in schools, school resource officers, can actually be damaging at times, especially to students of color. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the ways to really think about that at a fundamental level, and particularly at this time in our society, is particularly Black and brown kids don't necessarily feel an instant sense of calm and safety in their interactions with police officers. And so their interactions with police officers might actually elevate and escalate their feelings of lack of safety and feelings of agitation. And the challenge is that when this now happens in their school building, even if it is nothing has gone wrong, it's simply the aspect of interactions with people in uniform, in police officers, in and of itself begins to just be a triggering, escalating feeling and level of agitation. That in and of itself is a challenge. What we add to that is oftentimes kids exhibiting dysregulated behaviors or acting out behaviors are experiencing stress anxiety, trauma, distress in their lives, and what they need is to be responded to by a counselor or social worker or somebody who can ask more about what the underlying challenge is and move towards positive behavioral improvement, rather than a school resource officer who is more likely to just going to be responding to what that surface problem behavior is and identifying what is the punishment or what is the rule that's being broken that we can focus on, and doesn't then go beyond that, because it's not their role and it's not their training to focus on, well, something's probably wrong here. Let's figure out what's wrong, rather than just focusing on the rule that's being broken.
You also mentioned that school resource officers could, if they were trained differently, they had a different role, that it could actually be a positive role, and they could even be part of responding to students' social emotional needs. What would a very different role for them look like? And maybe could you give an example?
It's a very different role and requires a substantial amount of training. So it is not simply sending them for an 8-hour course or something like that in order to change their role and position in the school. And so just to make clear, for me, whenever a school has an opportunity to invest in either hiring a school resource officer or hiring a counselor or a social worker, they should hire a counselor or social worker. But if they have school resource officers in their building and they're trying to figure out how to improve their role and work with students, it's really, one, limiting all of the kind of punitive aspects of their work, meaning school resource officers should only become involved in students' challenging behaviors when it's a safety risk, an acute and immediate safety risk, in terms of when they're called in to take over a situation. All others should be handled by school staff. Another way to think about how to change the role of school resource officers is to use them in a very proactive way, which means if there are students who are identified as exhibiting behavioral challenges and students who have gotten in trouble often in the past, it is thinking about how can we have school resource officers work with them in a proactive way to build relationships with them, to work in a mentoring way and relationship. So it's really shifting. If there are kids that you are concerned about who have exhibited challenging behaviors, who have had previous contact with the school resource officers and things like that, or juvenile justice in the past, then how can we use our school resource officers in a mentoring way and in a proactive way to build positive behaviors among this group of students? So now, again, that, like I said, that requires really working with school resource officers and thinking about their training, because only a small percentage of school resource officers have received additional training that allows them to kind of function in that proactive and mentoring and developmental role.
You mentioned in the article about how important it is to be proactive in trauma responsive discipline, and that part of that is knowing your students well and being able to sense very early on when a student might be triggered and their trauma is kind of coming out. Can you say a little bit about ways that that can be done, especially when learning is remotely, and how teachers can know their students and start to know and see their triggers early on when it's through a screen?
Yeah, it's we're working on a brief on that right now, and it's tricky. It's tricky because really one of the things that teachers are dealing with this year is learning about their students entirely through this remote environment, which means you have much less of a sense of who they are and their personalities and all of those things that that you kind of use to kind of understand when something is not right. And you also don't have all of those informal interactions that give you information about students. So you really are in this remote context relying on behavioral cues that show up in the academic environment, such as the student not showing up, either entirely, you know, being absent in the online environment, or being here physically, but not engaging in any way. You know, they don't ever talk or communicate or interact. Or, you know, they are agitated, they're not, you don't see their eyes on the screen, they're always focused off to the side and things like that. And to do that, though, teachers really need to be engaging and interactive in their online synchronous classes, meaning there are lots of classes where the way that the teachers are doing it is they're just kind of giving information, and it's not very interactive. And so the challenge is, if it's not then interactive, then you can't see all those cues or realize, you know, oh, you know, Jason just never answers or engages in any of the questions or interactions. So it's really a matter of making those synchronous classes engaging and interactive so that you can have some back and forth and interactions with students to notice when they're disengaged completely and not interacting at all. But then also, students have been acting out in the online environment because if they're distressed and anxious and trying to get attention and trying to be seen, they're also going to do that online. And so again, it's a matter of recognizing when the student's trying to get your attention in these inappropriate ways, there's more going on. And so scheduling a one-on-one, you know, check-in time, or having office hours online and those types of things as ways to, and moments to kind of follow up on, hey, what happened? What was going on when you were behaving in a particular way?
So it might be important to get some one-on-one time with students.
Absolutely.
Can be done.
Yeah.